and I'm pleased to be here. This is my first duty, I guess one could call it, as having been cross-appointed or adjunct appointed to the Institute for Life Course and Aging, so I'm at home in that sense, and also pleased that we've had this year for the first time students from the Faculty of Music take courses here, and so we're developing a relationship because music is highly important in the life course, the full life course from prenatal through to end of life, and we believe there's a role that can develop there that will offer more to people, both in terms of understanding what is already, of course, valued and done, as well as perhaps new avenues for therapy, new avenues for engagement in the various points. I'm focusing on, a bit of a catchy title, sound health. We obviously all want to have sound health, as in, the health that is there, that is whole, but also in this case, sound as being the substance, the motor within which we can pursue health. And although I'm titling it Music Effects and Aging because of the context, many of this applies earlier in some of my stories. Cases that illustrate the points I'm trying to make are not from people who are old. Aging, of course, starts as soon as you're born, so aging is a long process. It's not a geriatric pursuit. So let me start with a few cases. Mike, who's a student of mine some years ago, and Mike came to me, wanted to sing in a choir. And so I gave him the audition, and Mike was horrible. Mike could not match pitches. He could not sing in tune, seemed to save his life. I'd play a note here, and he'd sing one over there or over there. It didn't seem to be consistent, above or below. He just was not even in the ballpark. And so I rejected him from the choir. So he came to me and said, could you give me singing lessons, sort of like a drowning person wants swimming lessons, right? This person didn't want to go to the Olympics. He just wanted to save his life in the musical pool. And so I found out that the motivation was high because his girlfriend was in the choir. And of course, choirs go on tour, and tours are highlights of student life. And he really was highly motivated to be in the choir. And so I gave him remedial lessons. Every week we met and we plodded away, and I used a nice model of psycho-cybernetics, sort of the heat-seeking missile. If you can get him closer to the point, eventually he'll hit it. I started matching his pitch rather than me expecting him to match mine, and developed this perceptual ability to hear and make the connection and coordination to actually be able to do what is a hugely complex task we just expect kids to learn automatically. It's highly sophisticated and complex. Well, the following year, in the fall, he came for the audition again. Not to me this time, but to the new choral director who didn't really know the background, and he passed. He was in the choir. He was now able to go on tour, and he actually married the girl. Great outcome.
Wow.
Yeah, highly successful vocal lessons. I've been working for the last number of years with Dr. Joseph Chen at Sunnybrook Hospital and others in an attempt to rehabilitate the ability to enjoy listening to music in people who have cochlear implants, particularly adults who became profoundly deaf later, later in childhood or adulthood. And what we found is that the devices are great for people who want to hear speaking, but they're not great for people who want to hear music. And so I approached it like a brain injury and saying, if we start at the very foundation of how children process sound in melodic patterns, basically babies are very good at hearing differences in pitch contours. So if you speak in a baby talk, you're enunciating more, and that's on purpose. That intuition is right. You should not stop talking in baby talk to babies, because that's how they learn language. They learn it by differentiating pitch contours. And the more we contour the pitch, the more they key into the differences. And so I'm starting with these people in pitch contours and differentiating contour from contour. And early results, now we're in our first big pilot, are showing that in fact people are regaining the ability to hear patterns and enjoy music. And if we presented more simple stuff, they can in fact start enjoying music. Jennifer was a student in the master's program at the Faculty of Music and suffered an injury that stopped her from being able to play flute at the highly sophisticated level that you need to as a performer. Devastated her life. In a course that she took from me, she wrote a piece called something like what it's like to be an injured musician, and looked deeply at that process. She moved into music education and became a teacher. The classic example: if you can't do, you can teach, which we of course try to dissuade, and of course it's really not true. Many of the music teachers are in fact superb performers, and that is why they can teach. But in her case, there was an injury which kept her from it. Student last year, a master's student, Song Kim, not at the Faculty of Music, but with a name like that, you'd expect she would be, but in biomechanical engineering, did a study at Holland Bloorview, in which the concern was you have silent children who can't communicate with anybody because of developmental issues or brain damage. And the challenge was, can we find a way to monitor and create synchrony between parent and child so that we know there's a connection happening? You know, very satisfying to the parent, no, I'm connecting to this child in a deep kind of a way. And so what we did in that case was to have a music therapist take music which responded sort of moment to the bioindicators from the child, and the parent wasn't even in the room, was through a glass, a mirror, a mirror. But the idea was that the parent would make a responsive connection mediated by the music and music therapist, and indeed the results showed that this happened. That, and particularly as session after session happened, they learned more to come into a connection, as monitored by EEG, EKG, skin response, cortisol levels, a whole host of bioindicators. Margaret, this lady called, well actually the connection was through a friend. I had never met her, who said, this lady, poor lady, can't sleep. She has terrible sleeping problems. She's been to sleep clinics. Nothing seems to work for her. Might your music help? So I said, well, here's the prescription. Do this with this CD and then with that CD, and then sort of call me a week later. Well, a week later I had a message on my answering machine that said, this is the Sleeping Beauty. For the first time in very long time, I've been able to sleep soundly. And so her prescription was to use a relaxation CD before she went to bed, then to play a particular sleep inducement CD while she was going to bed. And she also, because she had a hearing loss in one ear, I used a monaural bedside device which she actually used, and she fell asleep. And about a year or so later, when I talked to her, she said, you know, I don't really have to use this much anymore. I now just go to sleep. I said, well, I could have predicted that, because the brain actually relearns to do some of these things, because it is a problem of oscillatory coherence, and the brain can relearn that. The stories I've told you are 4 different types of connection between sound and health. The first is this ability to enjoy music. It's one of the things I would consider, for a person to be musically healthy in our society, which we hope everybody is at all ages, the person needs to develop and have the ability to perceive sound, to have the cognition structures to be able to make sense of it, and the physical coordination to be able to participate in music making. That we hope develops very early on through modeling, immersion in sound, and through teaching. That happens for many kids, from parents, but some from music teachers and others. And that's the goal of early music education, is to give all kids this basic ability to participate musically in the rites and rituals of society. you should be able to go to, synagogue, church, stadium, and participate in whether it's O Canada or a marching song or whatever it happens to be. One of the outcomes I would like to see on this is that if we actually reach this, I'd be able to go to a restaurant and hear a group of waiters sing "Happy Birthday" in tune. To me, that would be a great accomplishment, which is a bit hard to imagine, but that would be musical health. Another type is the health to make music, which performing musicians, of course, want. We have clinics now for the medical problems of performing musicians, and you can have a whole host of injuries that come from repetitive strain related to playing music, tinnitus to carpal tunnel syndrome, not tinnitus, tendinitis. You can get tinnitus too from sitting in front of the trumpets in the orchestra, which the flutes usually wear earplugs actually. I don't know if you know that, but many people in the orchestra wear earplugs because it's just too loud, particularly flutes, the woodwinds, because they're sitting in front of the brass. So they've got all these brass instruments blowing straight at your head. Imagine how loud that is. And how damaging that is to your hearing. And so many of them have custom-made earplugs that reduce that frequency. Focal dystonia in parts of musculature, fingers. Leona Boyd is famous for developing focal dystonia in her fingers. Her tremolo stopped working, and she's been in treatment for years for that, and is back just in the last year or two to playing again because of that problem. It's a brain issue that comes from overuse. Her explanation now is, which makes a lot of sense from a doctor in Spain, is that when you engage in an activity mindlessly, the brain starts to say, oh, that's a useless activity. We should actually, it's like a tremor, we should try to stop that. And she blames it on her husband, her ex-husband, because he wanted her to watch television with him and not just always practice. So what she did was she practiced while watching television. So she would not mentally be paying attention to her practice, but she'd be practicing her tremolos while just sitting, and that the brain probably perceived that as somehow wrong. I don't know the details of this. I'm not an expert in this area. Another is music therapy type 3. Song Kim was doing what a typical music therapist is doing, or the music therapist that worked in her study did. In other words, we're using music in a relationship with a child, with a parent. We're mediating something. We're helping learning. We're helping connection. We're helping recovery in a moment-to-moment monitoring therapist kind of a relationship. And the fourth is a category of music medicine. That is, the music did it. I didn't have to be there. There was no therapist. I just prescribed the sound, use it in this way. It's like taking medication here or doing your exercise there. And the music made it happen. I'm particularly interested in category 3 and 4, therapy and medicine. And the power of music that we've experienced usually is attributed there. And you know this for many years. Saul and David in the Bible story, as a classic case, Saul was tormented by a spirit, an evil spirit. We assume he was a bit stressed because the kingdom wasn't developing as it should, and there was, terror going on, and he was trying to marry wives. I don't know what all was happening at that time, but probably highly stressful things. And so he was over anxious. So he called the young David, who played the harp, and said, play harp for me. And when David played the harp, the spirit left him. Classic case where music can calm you, can make the evil spirit leave. And Andres Lozano, Toronto Western, in one of his TED talks, makes the connection between many of the ancient people and making holes in people's skulls to let the demons out. An early form of deep brain stimulation. Make a hole to try to let the pressure out. But this kind of work with that shows music has power is present in many, many cultures through history. From shamanist healing exercises to music in sort of trance situations to bells for meditation and prayer, etc. It has a long tradition, and music is considered powerful. Also connects to many different illnesses. There's lots of signs that it's affected or has had an effect in all sorts of places. facets in culture that probably describe this or help you understand this comes from Alan Merriam, an ethnomusicologist, who just in general describes the functions that music has in culture, in pretty much every culture. And so you can see if we key into this as a therapist or as therapy, it has potential to change things. So emotional expression, music is a great form of expressing your own emotion, letting the emotion be objectified and heard, and communicating it. There's great aesthetic enjoyment from music. It tends to elevate us and make us feel better in that way. Entertainment, just as a diversion. When your attention shifts away from the problems of life, you somewhat feel better. When your attention shifts from the pain you're experiencing, you don't feel as much pain. So just straight attention diversion is a great thing, and entertainment tends to do that. Communication, I've already alluded to. Symbolic representations of other things, ideas, and behaviors, certainly that can be part of it. It's not necessarily as healing. The physical response that we get, and we've not had research, really good research on this till recently, like Valerie Salampour, there's research in Montreal that shows that enjoyable music experience releases dopamine and therefore makes you feel better, and dopamine helps you control your movement if you have Parkinson's. So there's lots of places for application. Etc. And plus, all these means of the social connections that people have through music, from validating social institutions and religious rituals to conforming to social norms. So music is indeed powerful, but the question is why or how is it powerful? The power of music is often entwined, in my opinion, with the effect of music as physics, as vibrational force. We keep thinking that this stuff that we hear, that we get as compressions and decompressions of molecules that somehow make neurons fire, that's a specific entity called music. We just make it. Your cat does not hear these compressions in the same way as you do. This is a human learned ability to make sense out of sound in that particular way. And we have, of course, as a result, also start making sound compressions to have certain effects because of how we do hear. One of the interesting challenges would be, how do you make music for animals? Like, what responds? There was a movie some years ago called Whale Music, in which the rather psychotic person on the West Coast was trying to make music, not recording the whales for us to use in our context, but music for the whales to listen to, that the whales would want to come and hear. It's an odd sort of psycho challenge, which is, of course, what the movie was about. Not separating these two dimensions, the vibrational, the physics aspect from this cultural aspect of music, leads to a lot of attribution to music of power, a spiritual power, to metaphysical magic. It's just like, well, it just is that, it does this, it's because it's wonderful and it's magical. One of the movies you may have seen called Alive Inside, in which people who have Alzheimer's listen to music. The maker of that, Dan Cohen, at a panel when we screened that a year and a half ago, when asked, said, well, I don't really want to understand why, which to me was, as a scientist, I really want to understand why. Maybe as a practitioner, you don't need to understand why, you just want to understand how it works, how you use it, but I want to know why this works. The iPod project is, of course, one of those I just keyed into, that when you put the earphones on somebody and play music from the time they were a youth, suddenly you get arousal effect and you get a response in the brain which is amazing. The Mennonite Piano Concerto is here because it's one of the triggers for me. I grew up in a Mennonite community. My father was a Mennonite minister. I was not such a good boy because we weren't supposed to have musical instruments, but my mother, from a different group, tended to bring them in, so I had a lot of small musical instruments that we could put away if needed. And so I learned to play musical instruments and pursue music, partly because it was prohibited. I was the first person that actually knew out of our community that went on to advanced higher education. But some years ago, the Mennonite Piano Concerto, which you may have heard, Davies composed it, and you just hear it as a nice piece on the CBC. It's a wonderful piece. For me, it triggers a host of connections and memories, and often pushes the tear button at certain points because the tunes in it come from my childhood. These are the tunes I heard in church, at home, in all sorts of contexts. They were loaded with meaning, both the words of those tunes and the tunes themselves. So to me, it's not just a classical piece of wonderful piano music with orchestra, which it is, but it has those triggers for me. I put this in the category, and I will build for you a model of how music works in our lives. And the first level is this learned response, that as we grow and as we go through life, we start making learned connections to music. Broad connections to style, specific connections to individual songs. As you can say, that's our song, and when it plays, suddenly your heart beats a little faster. And the way we make use of this host of learned responses, which is most of what we do as music, is that it functions as mental arousal, as in the case of the iPod project. It's a means of engagement. You suddenly get connected, particularly if you're playing it. It's a means of communication. You can say things about how you feel by the music you either perform or you suggest. The meaning that's inherent in it, it creates a connection of empathy. So many of these things flow from this, and we can use this power in this way in music therapy context. So it's the biggest part of my circle which I'm building. When, many years ago now, I adopted a child. My wife and I adopted a child, and we got this child when she was 16 days old. And being a musician, my wife at the time was a piano teacher, and we thought, well, genetically we would have probably produced a musician, but what if this kid has like no musical genes? What do we do? So I loaded on all my musical teacher abilities and said, I'm going to, give this kid the best possible chance. So I picked what I considered to be the best child-friendly classical piece, Schubert's Symphony No. 5, First Movement, because it has fairly evident melodies, a fairly simple harmonic structure, a nice rhythmic flow. Everything was right, and it was really good rocking music or carrying music. So at 16 days old, the child comes home, and I start taking about 30 minutes every day to carry this child or rock this child to that music. Every day, same music, same. The idea, of course, was that I was going to do a really early learning experience, which later, of course, she doesn't remember at all, but she loves classical music, and she became a very good musician who could have come to the faculty of music as a performance, where she was playing cello concertos in high school and won competitions, both in composition and in performance. She became a visual artist instead, which is fine. Her cello still parked in a closet of the house. But she doesn't remember this early imprinting. But it had an effect on the brain. And there's very much we learn, whether it's prenatally from the steady heartbeat that the baby hears from the mother, in relationship to the mother is now getting more excited and the heart's going faster, or the mother is more relaxed, the heartbeat's going slower. All of that is learned, deeply ingrained in the brain in some form. And it shows up later as that's just how it is. Sheila Woodward, a colleague of mine for a year at the University of South Florida, when she did her doctoral work, did something which is probably a bit unethical here. I don't think we get too much approval for it, but she did it in South Africa. She convinced women to allow her to insert a marine microphone into, before the baby was born, into beside the baby's ear. And then play music from the outside and see what was actually coming to the baby's ear. I don't think you'd get ethical approval for that here. Not too many women would allow this to happen. I'm not sure how big the rewards were there. But what she did was she demonstrated that what the baby is hearing, what comes through most clearly, and then when she tested these kids some weeks after they were born, found that the mid-range stuff, another person did something similar in Australia, not with a microphone but with learning, and found that sort of the mother's alto voice, sort of lower in the range, around middle C, and piano music that's in that range is the best to get through to the baby's ears. And so that was the music that they most remembered. So to me, this is a learned response that I call encoded, isomorphic, or primal. That is, it's so low in our consciousness, it's so deep that it seems genetic. It seems like this is just how we are. The combined response between the learned associative and emotional, which you happen to do later and throughout life, and this very early, is a powerful force that music therapists use a great deal. That's the basic core. You have learned basically here what music does, the foundation for it. And the isomorphic extends, for example, to things like faster music would connect to faster heartbeat or faster leg movement or faster whatever. And it's a one-to-one relationship. Therefore, when we hear faster music, we hear it as more exciting. Because when you're more excited, you walk faster, you talk faster, your heart goes faster. It's a one-to-one relationship that is learned. It is not organic and natural. It is learned, in my opinion. You may remember the story of Gabrielle Giffords, the congresswoman who was shot through the head, and her recovery, which was dramatic. A lot of it was stimulated by music therapy, very specific music therapy that was aimed at restoring her access to her language centers here on this side of the brain by using music, sort of accessing it through that way. So the direct access to language in the normal channels wasn't working. She couldn't speak. But when they sang songs that came from childhood, deeply embedded in another channel, they could get to the words. And she started developing vocabulary and language through the use of music. Did a project in the mid-90s at Holland Bloorview in which we took kids who were front head injuries and they had attentional deficits. We were trying to rebuild attention. So we took the model of attention, Solberg-Mateer, for head injured people, and we operationalized it with music tasks. Jeff Jutai was the chief neuropsychologist. Roger Knox did a lot of the music, created the music for it. And what we found is that kids rebuilt their attention faster in the context of music tasks than they did with any of the other attention rehabilitation tasks. Why, you ask? Well, because, and Jeff Jutai's argument why this was tried was because he thought he believed he had seen that music processing used some of the same areas of the brain as attention, and that the neural warming, the warming of the neural networks through music would make it more likely to rehabilitate and make the connections that are needed for attention. And it seemed to work. This is part of that same process, that there are specific neural circuits, specific neural channels that are used in music but that have application in other areas. And so when there's a stroke damage, we can use potential neural channels that are connected to music in order to get at things that you can't get at otherwise. So we call this sort of the activation of cognitive neural channels. So neurologic music therapy, as a particular practice in music therapy, Dr. Michael Tout is sort of the originator and teacher of this. We just had a seminar last year here with 30 music therapists in Canada getting trained to use this. Know then and use a very particular form of music therapy to do neural rehabilitative things based on understanding of how music uses different channels. And these can be emotional channels, they can be motor channels, so we can do it with Parkinson's, for example, in a way to get motion and movement happening again. Margaret, back to Margaret and her problem, just to say that what I was doing in that case was suggesting sound which was driving oscillatory rhythmic coherence. What that means is that neurons fire in the brain. When they fire together, state changes happen. In order to be in the state of sleep, you need more electropotential power. In other words, more neurons in coherence in the delta area, in the 0 to 4 hertz area. We tend to sleep with sort of a dominant 2 hertz pulsation in the brain. There's a faster one imposed usually on it, but we have to have that dominant. when we're conscious and problem solving, we need a fairly fast one called beta. When we are relaxed, just brain idling, we have alpha. When we're deeply relaxed at the point of falling asleep, there's theta. We now also know there's gamma above 30, which is highly important in a lot of things. And people are exploring epsilon, the area below 1 or below 0, which takes us into body rhythms like the baroreceptor feedback loop, which has a pulsation between brainstem and heart at about 10 seconds, is the way that monitoring loop goes. So the question is, can we make those rhythms happen by stimulation? Well, electrostimulation essentially does this. Deep brain stimulation that drills a hole in the person's head and puts an electrode into a particular point to stimulate the subthalamic nucleus, for example, for Parkinson's, is inhibiting about 25,000 bad guys that are making the motor circuit upset. And when you silence them, the motor circuit works again. Deep brain stimulation also drives synchrony, not just inhibits it. And so the question is, at what point does it drive it? There's some theories now that indicate that there's some key points, like 300 hertz, or to be precise, 319, plus or minus 33, that is key in motor activity in Parkinson's people. And so it's controversial at this point. Does deep brain stimulation actually, in resonance, drive that, or how does it affect it? The point is that we can drive brain activity with stimulation, and sound is one of those things. So if I clap my hands like this, you think I'm just clapping my hands, but it sounds pretty exciting. The question is, how many times did I clap per second?
8?
Rough estimate? Probably about 4, around 4 or 5. It depends on how you're monitoring a second, which is about this. So it could be as fast as 6. That's in the theta zone. So although culturally, through the isomorphic learning, you hear that as a fast, fairly exciting rhythm, your brain is clicking now at firing. Your ears are firing in through the whole auditory system into the brain at about 5 times a second, driving theta, driving a trance state. You do that with techno music in a club with the expectation that you're going to be in a slow trance-like dance, and your brain gets a theta boost and away you go. You don't even need ecstasy to make that happen. I've seen theta boost within seconds. I do EEG with people and I use music to stimulate it. I had a wonderful piece of music designed for concentration to boost beta. And the composer did a good job according to my parameters, and when I put it on EEG, beta was boosted and theta basically stayed and alpha was great. Then the marketer said, that doesn't sound right. We want this music to appeal to 40-year-old American business males. Heck, now what do we do? They said this sounds too much like Chum FM. We want it to be. So they asked for a percussion track. So somebody started going, with a percussion on it. A student who came to my office while I was playing and said, "So now you're making porn music?" I said, "I was supposed to appeal to 40-year-old males. I'm not sure what that sound is, but maybe this is it." Anyway, when I put the EEG on and played this music, I got a major theta boost, because the rhythm of the drums were exactly in like 4, 5, 6 hits per second, driving that part of the brain activity, defeating, of course, the whole concentration, because we know attention deficit is a ratio imbalance between theta and beta. Kids who have ADD have too much theta, too little beta. So the traditional medical treatment is to give them an artificial stimulant, like Ritalin or Atenolol, boost beta. You can do it with coffee. Just boost your beta, suddenly they can attend. People like Linda Thompson and the Ad Center in Mississauga use neurofeedback, and they try to, with computer feedback, have kids drop the theta and boost the beta and help address attention deficit naturally. So we can drive brain activity. In Gabby Giffords' case, if you see the video, there's a scene where she's having trouble walking because the left side is affecting her right motor movement. And so the music therapist is playing a chord on the guitar exactly in rhythm of how she's supposed to walk, and lo and behold, her walking improves. You can also, in the many videos on the web, if you search for rhythmic auditory stimulation and Parkinson's, where you will see people go from hardly being able to walk to walking smoothly because of a click. You just need to add a click at the speed at which they're supposed to walk, and this click is perceived by the auditory system, gets transferred into that complex system of cerebellum to basal ganglia, and makes the connection happen and makes people able to walk. We did a cardio rehab study. Dr. David Alter was the lead on this at Toronto Rehab last year, and what we were doing was we're looking at people who had cardio events and were most likely to drop out of cardio rehab. So we enlisted them in the study, recruited them for it, and one group just do what you've been doing. You just walk around the track at Toronto Rehab, and we're just going to monitor you. The next group, we asked them to bring their playlist from their iPod or whatever, and then we arranged it according to walking, a good walking speed. And the third group, we did the same thing, but we took that music, put it in the computer, and we doctored it. We punched it up. We made the beat at which they were supposed to walk much stronger than it normally would be in the normal flow of the music. Not to the point that if you weren't aware of it that you would say, oh, there's something really weird with my music. We just, on the computer, made the signal a bit stronger by adding extra sound. What we found in the results was that the people who'd walked as prescribed got a little better in their fitness, as you would expect. The people with the music had a better fitness level than the people who just had no music. And the people who had the doctor music were significantly better than either of those two groups. And the reason we assume this is, our premise, our hypothesis is, that we were triggering that same brain response which makes movement easier because we're facilitating the brain connections for those people, therefore driving that movement forward. This is in this category which we don't normally assume as part of music, which is the rhythmic driving of neural activity. We can drive it at state level, so delta for sleeping, theta for deep relaxing and or trance, alpha for relaxing, beta for concentration, and we can drive it at gamma, for example, 40 hertz. It also, of course, applies at that's rhythmic auditory stimulation level at tracking and muscle response level, so the level at which you can actually pay attention to it, and your mind can actually follow the beat, or at beats which are so much faster that you could not possibly go. The question is, how fast can you possibly move any part of your body? Does anybody know the answer to that? How does the brain limit how fast you can move something? Musicians are interested in this, of course, because you can play a tremolo. How fast can you play a tremolo? How fast is it? Well, the limit is about between 8 and 10 hits per second. You cannot go faster. It's a limitation of the neural system and how fast it fires and connects to muscular response. So when we get things faster than that, we cannot physically respond, and after 16, we can't mentally separate them. Just like when you see a movie and the movie starts to flicker, it's because the images are not going around 16 images per second, and below you see individual images. Above, they were into a non-flickering whole. So typically now movies run at probably around 24 frames a second rather than as they used to, close to the flicker point. And the same thing with sound. We cannot technically and theoretically, physically differentiate individual sounds after about 16 per second. So it's the same perception rate as visual. So at 20 is usually the lowest when you see the specs on a sound system, 20 to 20,000. Well, that's the hearing range. You cannot hear below 20 hertz, and you cannot hear above 20,000 hertz. Bats can, maybe in cats. So the basic principle here is sound is vibration. Music is a cultural subset of sound, and that's the traditional basis for music therapy. That's fundamentally sound is vibration. So sound is audible vibration. Sound is a rhythmic pulsation and becomes electric firing in the brain. And so we call that rhythmic sensory stimulation, and we start using it intentionally, it's in the category of music medicine. This is where music takes on the function of medicine. This is no longer requiring cognition. It's not requiring association or musical response. It does it to the brain without you knowing or thinking about it. Tony Wigram, who unfortunately died 2 years ago of a brain tumor, did some really good foundational research in vibroacoustic therapy, or low-frequency sound that stimulates the body. And one of the studies he did in London at a hospital was with people who had mobility issues, and he treated them with low-frequency sound in the 30, 40, 50 hertz area at the very bottom of the piano. It's so low when you hear it a sine wave, you can barely hear it, but it's a pulsation that the body mechanoreceptors pick up, and you feel it as a vibration. And what he found was that after treatment, people had greater mobility. They could bend over further. Their movements were more mobile. There's a lady, case that Heidi Ahonen recounts, music therapist Wilfrid Laurier, on the nursing home on Eglinton, has a chair made in Finland that does low-frequency sound. And she was there, and a lady who had fairly advanced stage Alzheimer's, who was never conscious in the real world. She thought she was in a railroad station or someplace, and was not having any sensible conversations. Put her in this chair, played 40 hertz sound for her, so very low E on the piano is 40 hertz. And after 5 minutes, she suddenly said, "So what's the nursing station doing here?" It was like an intrusion into a railroad station. And after 15 minutes, she had a conversation with her husband, like he said, "I've not talked to her this way in 2 years." So the question is, what did that do? Did it restore circulation to the brain and consequently more energy in life? Did it drive neural activity? We did a study with fibromyalgia this past year in which we took 19 people with fibromyalgia. We treated them with 23 minutes of 40 hertz sound twice a week for 5 weeks. At the end of that time, a quarter of them had gone off all medication. The other 3/4 had all reduced their medication significantly. They all highly significantly, that is beyond 0.0001 significance, reduced pain reported. On the fibromyalgia quotient, they went from before like an average of 18 down to a 2. Their quality of life improved, their sleep was better, their depression was less. They were missing fewer days of work. All because they sat on a lounge for 23 minutes twice a week and subjected their body to 40 hertz sound. Now maybe there's a placebo effect because they came to the office, but it's also possible that gate control theory, which postulates that the spinal cord has essentially gates, that when they're stimulated, close the gate to pain and don't allow the pain to go to your brain. Gate control theory is somewhat tenuous these days because it's been replaced essentially with a brain matrix theory of pain, but there's still some evidence from some belief, although skeptical, from people like Karen Davis, the Toronto Western neuroscientist that specializes in pain, that in fact that may be part of the explanation. But we think it's probably more of a neural driving. So what I'm pointing to here is that there's another level of response to the body to sound, which is the sensory cellular level. Mechanoreceptors, Pacini corpuscles, Merkel discs, etc., that are in your skin that respond to vibration. And stimulating those has an effect. Also stimulating muscle resonance through this and blood increases things like circulation. You could do lymphatic massages with sound that changes from lower to higher, and like this fancy finished chair, resulting in things like increased mobility, decreased pain, and so on. So FDA approved this around 1995 or so for 3 medical claims: increased circulation, decreased pain, increased mobility. Research at that time also was asking for a decrease in blood pressure, but they felt there wasn't enough evidence for at that. But I've seen many cases where I put people on a vibroacoustic system and their blood pressure is 10 points lower 15 minutes later than it was before. It's one of the contraindications, actually, we say if you have low blood pressure, you maybe should not be using low frequency vibration. We of course know that there's also such a thing as a low frequency disease, that DJs in clubs that subject themselves to a lot of low frequency for many, many hours can get serious medical symptoms that seem to be related to that constant bombarding of the body with low frequency waves. So the question is, does this whole model at which the body responds from a cellular level through to our associative learned work simultaneously? And the answer, I think, is yes. Making music, of course, highly potent and highly powerful in the hands particularly of somebody who knows how to target this. And that's, of course, where we're hoping, to increase knowledge and learning in this. So very quickly then, some of the applications to this, how might music and sound address particular problems? Well, the easiest and first is stress. It's just music as culture already is relaxing. If you also have activity in it at sort of the alpha level, which you can with certain harp strums and xylophone rolls and so on, you often get alpha level activity, will just drive the brain toward a more relaxed alpha state. And you can consequently see in cases where there's reduced cortisol in people who've sung in choirs or listened to music, the neurotransmitter associated with stress. It can boost immune system. We've seen studies that report increases in interleukin 1 and 2, and it can have a reduction in many other health symptoms that are stress related. Some statistics show that the conditions that family practice doctors see in their offices, about 80% of them are somehow related to stress. So if we could just reduce stress in our society, we can already start alleviating a lot of health problems. Another is sleep. Sleep is a huge issue in our society, and it becomes a greater issue as people age, partly because we find that the way that the brain oscillatory activity changes is that people have less delta coherence. In other words, there's less activity in the deep sleep area, and so you have cases like my mother when she'd be over in my house and in the afternoon she'd be lying on the sofa and I'd hear her snoring away, and 30 minutes later I'd talk to her and she said, "Oh no, I wasn't sleeping at all for that whole time." Of course she hadn't been sleeping. She was probably sleeping at a theta level where she was still semi-conscious, but that's as low as the brain was going to go. And so partly we can help this by giving extra help to the low brain frequency with delta stimulus. So I'm a strong believer in grandfather's clocks that tick at 2 times a second. If you have something ticking at 2 times a second at the delta deep sleep level, it'll probably feel like it hypnotizes you into sleep. Probably also explains why you go to Roy Thompson Hall and they're playing a Bach slow movement and you go to sleep, because the events going by are at probably about 2 per second. That's just the rate of a Bach slow movement most of the time. So there are many, many conditions which are associated with lack of sleep and huge cost economically, from everything from highway accidents and aches and pains and mood disorders, that if only we could fix sleep, it would help. So music can certainly do that. Another is arousal level. That is, particularly in aging, as I mentioned, the general oscillatory power slows down. We get sort of a decline, and a lot of cases in an Alzheimer's dementia case, there's just not an adequate level of arousal. When my father was in his 90s, he was fine up to then. He was driving his car, backing into things more frequently until the cost of paying off people in the parking lot became too high. We took his car away. We would bring Tim Hortons with him, because in the nursing home that he was only getting decaffeinated coffee, which doesn't help arousal at all. And we figured if we bring him some real caffeine, we'll have a better conversation, which we usually did. It's just, and music contributes to that arousal level. It just gets the brain going again. We now also know that gamma activity above 30 is a correlate of cognition. And what we've seen is that there's a general drop-off in gamma with aging, and a particular drop-off in the 40 hertz range with Alzheimer's. We're going to explore, I'm writing a proposal now for a study where we're hoping to look at 40 hertz as a biomarker for Alzheimer's. And then with the treatment, we're starting, hopefully next week. We have just gone through a year of CSA approvals and ethics review board, etc., for an Alzheimer's study in which we're using this Finnish chair at 40 hertz with 3 different stages of Alzheimer's, and monitoring. We're currently doing neuro MEG studies looking at whether we can drive 40 hertz in Alzheimer's brains, with the idea that if we can restore the power level in gamma at the 40 hertz level, can we also sharpen cognition? The cases that we've had, like the one I told you about in the Finnish nursing home and others, show that it does seem to have that effect. And so it's one of the things we're hoping to explore. And the success of the iPod project is directly that through music. Another is dysregulated neural circuits. One of the most commonly identified for at least enough more years is thalamocortical dysrhythmia. The circuit between the thalamus, which is the core of the old brain, all the senses come in, and the cortex, the thalamus, that loop of electrical activity can go out of rhythm. When a dysrhythmia develops, that dysrhythmia usually is featured by an increase in theta activity, in low and slow speed activity. So there's sort of a deterioration of what should be the normal idling speed of the brain in alpha, around 10 hertz, and it slows down, so there's less activity there and more in the slower activity between 5 and 6 and 7. That tends then, and particularly depending on the area that's being affected, sort of starves the cortex in that area, and it tends to start going dark, and it's surrounded, because of what that does to the unaffected neurons, brighten them up in what we call my brain just went into one of those modes. It has a name, I'll come to it shortly when my brain starts functioning. Bit of a circuit problem. The edge effect, so the edge of the circle is brighter in a sense. The assumption is that this kind of a dysrhythmia is related to Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, depression, tinnitus, schizophrenia, to some extent an epilepsy, not completely, and other things, neurogenic pain. So the challenge then is, how can you re-regulate this dysrhythmia? How can you regulate that rhythm? And much of what has developed as deep brain stimulation focuses around re-regulating those circuits. They address more than thalamocortical circuits right now, but they are a heart of them. So when you are trying to stimulate a part of the brain, either to suppress some activity or drive other activity with deep brain, or with repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, or transcranial direct stimulation, a lot of this is the goal. Much of that is being driven in frequencies which are connected to that kind of a problem. So the question is, does music fit into this in some way? And that's what I'm hoping to explore in writing a grant right now. And as I mentioned, the fibromyalgia study does exactly that. And we had a study on Parkinson's that similarly showed that. So the question is, can music re-regulate that? There is obviously some music effect. Specific rhythmic stimulation seems to be able to address this. I'm calling it rhythmic sensory stimulation. But this will require specifically engineered music rather than simply music as music. You can't just turn on classical FM and expect that this will happen. So the neurological effect of rhythmic sensory stimulation is fairly cutting-edge research. There are a few studies at various points in the world that are starting to look at this, at how vibration affects certain things. One, for example, that was done in Australia, I believe, was looking at, sort of in vitro, whether the brain cells associated with Alzheimer's, whether you can make them grow again with sound stimulation. In fact, they found 40 hertz stimulation the most potent to make neural cell outgrowth happen. So one of the things that we're looking for, both in deep brain stimulation that Andres Lozano is working on, and that we're of course interested in with cases like the tumor, surgery kids, and we've got an RSS study happening there right now, as well as the stuff with Alzheimer's and Baycrest, is whether we can contribute to new cell growth, not just to sort of keep what's there, but actually to rehabilitate some of these things. And there's just a few little tidbits of research that are tantalizing that say perhaps this is possible. There's a study reported in California at a conference, not yet published, that seems to show that there's particular brain cells associated with myelin growth. And the kids, sick kids that have had their brains irradiated after cancer tumors, have a decrease in myelin sheets. So the question is, if we stimulated them with 40 hertz, would they regrow myelin? And would that then contribute to, again, increase in speed in brain-to-brain communication? We don't know. That's why we're just starting with a very basic 6-minute task. Can we drive 40 hertz in these kids' brains? If we can make it happen, then we can go to the next stage in a phase 1 type trial and say, well, let's try it with a group of kids and see whether after a certain length of stimulation, their response speed is actually increasing. Then there's, of course, a variety of health effects, as I already mentioned, around the 40 hertz frequency. We did a study, I wasn't part of it, but two of my associates, Quincy Almeida and Hadia Honan, with Parkinson's patients. They had 40 Parkinson's patients, 20 with a tremor, 20 with movement, sort of frozen movement condition. And what they did was they stimulated them for 5 minutes with 30 hertz sound in the fancy finished chair. 1 minute on, 1 minute off, 1 minute on, a typical stimulus kind of a protocol. And they found on the standard Parkinson's outcome measures that on all metrics, these people showed significant improvement. 5 minutes of stimulation. So one of the things that I'm writing into this grant currently is to do essentially a replication of that and to potentially explore some other frequencies that might work as well or better. And I already told you about the pain study. There are other studies from vibroacoustic therapy that's been explored without really a knowledge of how it affects the brain for many years in Norway and in Finland. Olaf Skill is still working on this, though he's quite elderly now. And they have found things like 52 hertz for epilepsy, 40 to 68 hertz for stress and depression, etc. There's also a physiologic effect to low-frequency sound, this business of actually vibrating muscles and cells, deep joint penetration. I'm going to mention these claims and these kinds of results. One of the interesting connections that a person in my research team for the grant I'm writing now, Ledan Yu and Craig Simmons in biomechanical engineering, found that when you stimulate bone cells with low frequency sound, the bone cell increases and it gains greater density. So potentially, an osteoporosis treatment might be listening to a lot of low bass sounds. Just hang out in the clubs and your osteoporosis gets better. We would probably control it with vibroacoustics in some way, but hope that it would in fact have a treatment effect. No research beyond, again, in vitro cells that are put in gelatinous and we blast them with sound. Of course, a lot of the vibratory things like lung secretions are logical. If you feel the vibration, this low vibration on your back, it'll shake things loose, and we'll have those kinds of results. So the question then, how do you apply all this stuff at all these ages? Of course, music is still always a potent means of social connection. Music is like people say, the language of the soul. It gets to your emotions. It gets to your sense of fulfillment in life. It's something we engage in. The brain loves engagement and learning at all ages. It develops new neural outgrowth and plasticity when you're learning at all ages. So it's good to start piano lessons if you've always wanted to, even though you're 80. We have a study with one of our graduate students at a nursing home where we had all plus 80-year-old people taking piano lessons and doing improvisation. Her big experiment was, we also have them improvise, which means that there's more cognitive involvement. And it just leads to a better sense of self and a sense of fulfillment, and quality of life measures improve. We can use it as a neural channel activator with specific knowledge. We can use it as a brain state inducer in a music medicine way. And so we have potential in all sorts of ways around this. Any questions? Yes.
Just a comment. I have a friend in England who had a severe stroke and he couldn't speak at all, but his wife reported he could sing, and that was their communication.
Yeah.
They just sang to each other.
Yeah, they're different neural channels, and one may be destroyed and the other may not be. And it's amazing how redundant our language system is in a part that's connected to music.
Give me an example what 40 hertz sounds like or feels like.
Well, if you have a piano, the lowest E on the piano, it's lower than I can sing, is 40 hertz. Now the problem with the piano is that the string actually goes immediately into overtones. So as soon as you hit it, you're never hearing the fundamental. So to get a real sense of what that sounds like, go to the lowest E on an organ on an 8-foot, on a 32-foot pipe, and play a 32-foot E. That'll give you a fundamental rich sound, which is just, you're hearing it almost like feeling it rather than hearing it, because it's that low at just the sine wave, at the pure fundamental. The lowest possible sound that you can hear and that's ever used in an organ is a 64-foot pipe, which goes an octave below that. But this A would be this sound would be a 40-foot, a 32-foot organ pipe at an E.
I'm living in a church. If I'm talking at decimal level, like a wash machine or dryer, I'm looking at something I can relate to.
It'll never be loud. You'll never hear 40 hertz loud unless it's rich with overtones, then you're not hearing 40, you're hearing all the overtones like in the piano. Or it's electronic amplified, so a bass, a double bass, when it's plugged into an amplifier, will give you a pretty good 40 hertz at the low E. Or a bass guitar, its lowest string is an E. When you play it open, bass guitar open, that through a good bass amp, then you will be hearing a 40 hertz. But the guitar also fairly quickly deteriorates into overtones. So it's very low. You can feel it very distinctly when it's played through a transducer. And what a transducer is a device like, have a picture, right? Because people always ask this, that has inherent in this I-beam base a long bar. So all the speakers are transducers. There's a magnet that activates this little thing that activates a cone, right? That's how sound gets produced. In this case, there's a coil around a long metal bar that makes this whole metal bar go back and forth. That metal bar is so heavy that it shakes the whole thing. So this I-beam base device, when it has holes down here, when it gets screwed against this table, this whole table becomes a flat panel speaker and you hear a very low sound. If I just held up the I-beam base, you would hear nothing. So the shaker, sometimes they're just called base shakers, is what we use in devices like this. This is that $10,000 Finnish Next Wave chair. It has speakers, 4 locations, so you get it in your calves and seat and middle and high back, and it is a speaker specifically designed like a subwoofer speaker, which is different than a device like this, which actually uses a flat pancake transducer with a weight. The previous one cost $10,000. This one costs $300. It is available on the internet. Called Sound Oasis VTS 1000. And it's an easy way for people to get into vibroacoustic therapy. The sleep track on that features a ground bass at 30 hertz, in other words, at the treatment that was used for Parkinson's and at Laurier, and helped the Parkinson's response. Most of the other tracks are set at a 40 hertz center, so in the key of E, so that 40 hertz is the most dominantly stimulated. But it's that kind of an option. We're planning to use this device in our several of our studies. Back pain study is currently in design at Mount Sinai. That'll use this. We'll probably use it also in a depression study, which will be part of the Canbine depression study. and other studies, because it's portable and so cheap.
And the comment from Howard, who's watching online, mentioned that you can actually Google 40 hertz and hear it on the internet.
If you got if you got a good subwoofer attached to your computer. Yes.
Do you use or do you consider this theory by Stephen Porges called polyvagal theory in your use of, I guess, considering the therapeutic effects of music? I've just sort of become aware of it recently, and I just don't know, is it sort of on the fringes, or is it like accepted? Is it more accepted evidence?
It's probably still a bit on the fringe, but Stephen Porges is has got some really great ideas. There's vagal nerve stimulation, electronic stimulation now that actually stimulates that nerve. I think it explains a lot. I have one colleague who's adjunct appointed to the Faculty of Music, Shari Geller, who is a personal, acquainted with Dr. Porges, and she's a psychologist who uses mindfulness drumming as part of her therapy, and part of it comes from her understanding of polyvagal theory. So no, it's not completely peripheral. It's I don't think it has had probably as wide an acceptance yet, or the implications of it as he would like, and probably as it deserves. But no, it goes to what I've for years referred to as the baroreceptor feedback loop between brainstem and heart. In all my music, the 25 CDs I've created that do music and health, most of them have a 10 or 11 second cycle in it that nobody ever hears unless I point it out, but that contributes to the general sense of rightness about the music, because it so corresponds to the fundamental rhythm of our body, that feedback loop, which goes off with stress. I mean, the stress will just bang the crap out of that. Anybody else? Yes.
Just a comment. I remember being stopped for speeding once, and I lived in the States. I had to go to traffic school, and they were talking about how it was like hands up who was listening to rock music when they were stopped, hands up who was listening to classical music when they were stopped. And it was amazing how much what you were listening to in the car was affecting your driving without you being conscious of it.
Yeah, it's in the arousal levels, certainly. It's in the driving point. I was interviewed a couple of years ago by Truck Driver magazine. And one of the things they wanted to know is there better or worse music to listen to while driving your truck? And my answer was, it depends on what state you're in. Like if it's in the middle of the night and you're falling asleep, you probably will benefit from some pump up arousal music. But if you're coming into the city and you're looking for a street address, you probably want to turn the music down, because we know there's an interference, a cross-modal interference between hearing and seeing. And you definitely want to avoid music that has a steady delta pulse. So you have to listen to what that is, or even theta. So I would not recommend techno trance music to be used by truck drivers or any drivers at all. The music that I designed that goes to all these states, some years ago, but 10 years ago or more by now, we were asking a new composer to come in to become acquainted with this approach, and I would work with him. And the first meeting with the CEOs, just to convince them to do the project, they gave them some samples of what I'd done. They all have warnings in them, say do not play in the car, and the guy, of course, didn't believe that there was anything to this, and put one of our Theta albums into the car, and was driving home, and suddenly found that he was 4 exits beyond where he wanted to get off the freeway. Predictable effect, because the stuff, that Theta album, Natural Massage Therapy, is a highly, highly potent theta inducer, and he was just put into a state that was essentially a trance state. Other people report that it's like smoking a joint. We warn not to try to move or get up in the middle of the album, because you will probably be dizzy, your muscles will be weak. At Somerset, the people in the office, when they played it through the sound system, reported they couldn't type, they couldn't type anymore, because their muscles. Massage therapists have reported that they can't complete the massage when they're playing it because their muscles go weak. That's what I did it for, and we put the warnings in. People don't take this stuff seriously.
Where do we get it?
You can probably get it on the internet. Most of my stuff is available at Amazon.com.
Yeah, so this is reminding me of some of the work that I do with dissociation. Are there studies that actually find out more about how to control the dissociative states?
Robert Monroe, who came up with binaural detunement and brainwave entrainment, he wanted to achieve a state at which he could do out-of-body experience. So he believed that binaural detunement was the key to that. Now, I use binaural detunement on almost every CD. Essentially what that means is I want, for example, to do an entrainment at 10 hertz. I will take the bass line, or a nice lower line that you're hearing is just the baritone line, and we'll make a copy of it in the computer. So now there are 2 copies of this line, so 2 versions of the line. We take one, we put it on the right side, and the other one on the left side, so when you listen to it on your earphone, and then we detune them by 10 hertz. And that detunement creates a wah 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 effect when you hear it in the room. When you put that to your brain now has to justify this out of sync vibratory pulse.
You deliberately make them out of tune.
Yeah, we deliberately,
How much out of tune?
by the target. So when we do a sleep album, I detune it by 2 hertz. When I make a theta album, I detune it by 5 hertz. So the natural massage therapy, the composer who I worked with sort of threw the whole toolkit at it and took everything he had written and detuned the entire thing. So the entire album is detuned, which makes this like super potent, powerful detunement, entrainment stuff, because now the head just going whoa from this. I've actually felt my head go rapidly side to side internally from detunement. And so that is Robert Monroe's theory was that would contribute to out-of-body experience. I've never, had people say they, completely dissociated, unless, of course, they're wanting to disassociate from stress and anxiety. I've had people who call me or email me say, I'm listening to this CD and I suddenly find myself breaking into tears for no explicable reason. Why is that? And the short answer to that is that seems that traumatic memory sits pretty low in the thalamus, and these lower frequencies tend to be the lower thalamic frequencies. So when you listen to entrainment at these theta low alpha states, you are probably going to shake loose the deep traumatic memories. So it's been effective, for example, in neurofeedback and in treatment with treatment-resistant addicts. There's a study done around year 2000 in Los Angeles with 100 treatment dropout addicts, and they treated them first with beta to normalize the brain, and then with this low alpha, and found that they had a much, much higher recovery rate, or the recidivism, or whatever you want to call it, and the failure rate was much better with those who had that treatment. So it acts in a crude way like rebooting the brain. I'm quite anxious to study post-traumatic stress disorder with some of these techniques, and Heidi Ahonen is currently working and designing with post-traumatic stress music therapy. So we need to find out whether there's some potential
What's
there.
that last name?
Heidi Ahonen at Wilfrid Laurier University. She's head of the Music Therapy Research Center there. Yes?
I had a strange experience listening to Nexus and Talk percussion groups playing, I think, a piece of John Cage's work. I began to feel quite sick listening, and I realized that the beat was based on a 60-second beat, and my pacemaker's set at 60. And I was about to leave in spite of the chaos that would cause to climb over everybody and get out.
You were creating a neural driving response which was clashing with your heart pacemaker electrical signal. One of the things we warn about in all these devices is don't use it with people who have pacemakers. Because the low frequencies... I wondered if
it was a real experience or what.
No, it could very well be a real driving experience, because the other thing is, although they weren't playing at 60 hertz, they were playing at a multiple. One of the studies we've just done as part of exploring this rhythmic sensory stimulation is to drive stimulation at 20 hertz and then look at what's happening in the brain. And what we find out is that there's a very strong response of a synchronous 20 hertz response in the brain. In other words, they're dancing at 20 hertz too, but also at 40 and 60 and 80. So they go up to 3 multiples before it dies out. And what happened was that the first time 20 was much stronger and these were relatively weaker. But the next time and the next time, the 20 stayed, but the 40, 60, 80 got stronger. The brain learned to respond more liberally to those. So although you may be getting, a xylophone response that's repetitive, like Philip Glass's music, John Cage's music, Steve Halpern's music, Steve Reich's music, a lot of that music can drive brainwave activity, and it will not just do it at the 8 or at the 10, but it'll do it at multiples. So that if there's something is happening at 10, if we go 3 multiples, we could well be 10, 20, 30, 40. You're into that gamma area where you may be getting some interference. And there's also some hint that it goes downward. So depending on what the frequency was, it could have a multiple effect to stimulate it. So beware of very repetitive music is the key.
But do you have any suggestions for resources to learn more about what you're talking about? Sort of at an introductory?
There's a book, it's very expensive because it's a limited print, edited by Jonathan Berger, called Rhythmic Stimulation of Sound or something of that sort. It's the papers from a conference that happened in 2006 at Stanford University. And it's probably the best overview of the sort of rhythmic driving effects. I have a copy, I think probably paid $80 for it on Amazon, I'm not sure. But that's probably the best. There's an individual chapter within book called The Physician Music of Physicians, The Physician and Music, and I forget, it's a combination of physician and music, edited by the same guy that does the Mozart Effect, Don, whatever his name is. But there's only one chapter in that book. And then there's individual things. There's even more hard to get books on music medicine that have individual chapters, but you probably wouldn't find them. They may be in the faculty music library, but I have copies, but I had to buy them to use bookstores in England and that sort of thing. They're not easy to come by. Anything else? Okay, yeah.
Sorry, just those, you mentioned 2 names, Margaret Salenpour?
Valerie Salenpour.
Or Valerie. How do I spell out the last name? You said she...
Salimpoor, I believe. She was a student at McGill. She is currently, unless she's left, but she was last fall, postdoc at Baycrest.
Okay.
Sorry,
And Dr.
my ride is
Michael
probably...
Dr. Michael Tao?
Tout, T-H-A-U-T. One of the things you might be interested in is the research center at the Faculty of Music called the Music and Health Research Collaboratory, MAHRC, M-A-H-R-C. And if you go onto the Faculty of Music website, the main website, primitive as it is, we're working on a new one, there's under About Us, the first sort of pull-down tab at the very bottom is MAHRC. And you go to the MAHRC webpage, there's a category for news, and under that you will find like 16 newsletters. The last 3 or 4 have information about Michael Tout, because he's done lectures here, he's done training courses here. He is my proposed visiting scholar for the new Connaught grant, because he's the world leader in neurologic music therapy. He's at Colorado State University. And if any of you want to, if you see that on the MAHRC and you want to get it, sent to you as email, just email me at music.research@utoronto.ca.
I'm sorry, that was M-A-H-R-C.
C. Music and Health Research Collaboratory.
kids with the possible dangers of repetitive. I mean, it seems to be beneficial, but to have some dangers.
ADD making.
A lot of rock music is very driven rhythmically.
ADD making.
Is that what's contributing to it, do you think?
Think so? A lot of stuff that is repetitive in the 3, 4, 5, 6 hertz area boosts theta. We're already fighting an imbalance between theta and beta. If you keep boosting theta, you're going to get more depressed and you're going to get more ADD issues. In my opinion, it should be screened and banned. I'm a contributor to this at one point by accident almost. My wife and I did all the Fisher-Price designs up till about 3 years ago. We did about 65 Fisher-Price albums. And one of the first batch of about 12 that we did, they wanted a Dance Baby Dance album. And, you know, these young CEOs and marketers were parents, and they were from that generation, so they wanted sort of a techno dance album. So we had, you know, all the standard kids' tunes done as techno dance music. So I get the first draft of this, and I was afraid of this, and I listened to it, and it's all hitting in the theta zone. So my response to them was, you just created the best, you know, device here to create ADD in kids. We can't release this thing as it is. So, well, then what's the solution? Well, my solution was, and it's not necessarily the most effective one, was to say double and triple each of the notes that you have by putting in a slight echo into this. So instead of hearing just tick, 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 you hear tick, 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 tick. So there's a slight decay in as if it's echoing very rapidly in a rhythmic way that pushes this thing up to 15 hertz beta. So my theory was, and I didn't EEG test it on kids, so it's theory only, what that would do would at least compensate with some extra beta driving and wouldn't completely imbalance it. But that's really, and I've done that a number of albums, is to try to keep the theta from, you know, it still sounds to you like that frequency, but in fact in the brain there's a more rapid response. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.